David Thornton buried his father on a Monday in March 1983, under a sky so gray it seemed to press down on the small cemetery outside Winterset, Iowa. The service was brief, attended by 47 people who had known Raymond Thornton as a cautious man, a careful farmer, and someone who had survived the Depression by never spending a dollar he did not absolutely have to spend. David was 31 years old, married with 2 young children, working as an agricultural loan officer at the Farmers Trust Bank in Des Moines, a job that paid him $32,000 a year and came with health insurance and a pension plan. He had not planned to be a farmer. He had left the farm at 18, gone to Iowa State, studied finance, and built a life that was stable and predictable in ways that farming could never be. But Raymond had died suddenly, a massive stroke while checking cattle on a Wednesday afternoon, and now David was standing at the graveside trying to process the fact that he had just inherited 500 acres of some of the best farmland in Madison County, land that was completely paid off and worth, according to the most recent assessments, somewhere between $450,000 and $500,000. The funeral reception was held at the Methodist church in town, and it was there, while David was accepting condolences and eating casserole from paper plates, that the first offer came. A man named Roger Dietrich, who farmed 1,200 acres on the north side of the county and who had been eyeing Raymond's land for years, pulled David aside near the coffee table and said he wanted to talk business when David was ready. "Not today," Roger said, out of respect, "but soon," because he knew David had decisions to make, and he wanted David to know he was interested in the property. Roger did not mention a number, but the implication was clear. David was not a farmer. David had a good job in the city, and Roger assumed David would want to liquidate the asset and move on with his life. It was a reasonable assumption, the kind of assumption that most people in the room would have made, but it unsettled David in a way he could not immediately articulate. His father had been dead for less than a week, and already people were circling. By Tuesday, 3 more men had called the house. One was a local real estate agent who specialized in agricultural properties and who wanted to list the farm. Another was a farmer from the next county who had heard about Raymond's death and wanted to make a cash offer. The third was a land investor from Des Moines who explained that he represented a group of clients interested in acquiring productive farmland as a hedge against inflation, and he could close quickly if David was motivated to sell. David listened to each of them politely, said he would think about it, and hung up feeling increasingly disturbed by the speed and the presumption. His father had worked that land for 43 years, had paid off the mortgage in 1971, had maintained the soil and the fences and the drainage tiles with a meticulousness that bordered on obsessive. And now, less than a week after Raymond was in the ground, strangers were calling to discuss how quickly they could convert his life's work into a transaction. By Wednesday, the calls had increased. 2 more farmers, another real estate agent, and a man who introduced himself as a farm management consultant, but who seemed to be functioning as a broker for unnamed buyers. David stopped answering the phone and let his wife, Janet, field the calls, writing down names and numbers on a notepad that was filling up faster than seemed decent. On Thursday, David drove out to the farm for the first time since the funeral, ostensibly to check on the livestock and the buildings, but really to try to figure out what he was supposed to do. The farm looked the way it always had, 500 acres of gently rolling land divided into 4 fields, a modest 2-story farmhouse that Raymond and David's mother had built in 1959, a large red barn, a machine shed, 2 grain bins, and a cattle lot that currently held 32 head of Black Angus that Raymond had been raising for beef. Everything was in good repair. The fences were tight, the buildings were sound, the equipment was older, but functional. It was a working farm, not a show place, and it generated income in the steady, unglamorous way that good farms do when they are managed conservatively. David walked the perimeter of the north field, the one that bordered the road, and tried to calculate what the farm was actually worth, not in market terms, but in productive terms. Raymond had rented out 300 acres to a neighbor named Tom Hackett, who paid $70 per acre in cash rent, which came to $21,000 per year. Raymond farmed the remaining 200 acres himself, rotating corn and soybeans, and in a typical year he netted somewhere between $25,000 and $30,000 after expenses. Add in the cattle operation, which brought in another $8,000 to $10,000, and the farm was generating roughly $50,000 to $55,000 in annual income, more than David was making at the bank. That number surprised him. He had always thought of farming as a marginal enterprise, something people did because they loved it or because they did not know how to do anything else, not as a rational economic activity. But $50,000 a year from an asset that was completely paid off and that required, in Raymond's case, only part-time management, was not marginal. It was significant. On Friday morning, David was sitting in the farmhouse kitchen drinking coffee and going through Raymond's financial records when he heard vehicles pulling into the driveway. He looked out the window and counted 5 trucks, all of them belonging to farmers or land buyers he recognized from the previous week's calls. They had not called ahead. They had simply shown up, apparently coordinating among themselves. And now they were walking toward the house with the purposeful stride of men who had decided that Friday was the day to make their move. David opened the door before they could knock, and the group arranged themselves on the porch and in the yard. 15 men in total, some of them farmers David had known since childhood, others he had never met. Roger Dietrich spoke first, saying they did not mean to intrude, but they wanted to make sure David understood the situation. Land prices were at historic highs, Roger said, and if David was going to sell, now was the time to do it. Several of the men nodded in agreement. One of them, a younger farmer named Brad Kensington, said he was prepared to offer $475,000 cash, closing in 30 days, no contingencies. David listened to the offers, and there were multiple offers, numbers ranging from $450,000 to $510,000, each one presented with a slight edge of urgency, as if the opportunity might evaporate if David did not act immediately. The men were not being malicious. David understood that. They were being rational. Land was valuable. David was not a farmer, and from their perspective, they were doing him a favor by offering to take a complicated asset off his hands and convert it into liquid capital that he could invest or spend however he wanted. But standing there on his father's porch, listening to 15 men discuss the monetary value of a place that Raymond had spent 4 decades building, David felt something shift inside him. He thanked them for coming, told them he appreciated the offers, and said he was not ready to make a decision. The men exchanged glances, the kind of glances that suggested they thought David was making a mistake by waiting, and then they left, their trucks kicking up dust on the gravel driveway as they headed back to their own farms and their own calculations. David spent the rest of Friday going through more of Raymond's records, trying to understand not just the financials, but the philosophy behind them. Raymond had kept meticulous notes, not just about yields and expenses, but about soil conditions, weather patterns, drainage issues, equipment maintenance schedules, livestock health, and market timing. The notes revealed a man who thought in decades, not in seasons, someone who made decisions based on what the land could sustain over the long term, rather than what it could produce in any given year. Raymond had never chased the highest possible yields. He had never leveraged the farm to buy more land. He had never adopted the newest technology the moment it became available. Instead, he had focused on consistency, on keeping his costs low and his debt non-existent, on building equity slowly and never putting the farm at risk. It was an approach that seemed almost quaint in 1983, when the dominant philosophy in American agriculture was to expand, to borrow, to invest in the latest equipment and the most aggressive production methods, to bet that commodity prices would stay high and that land values would keep rising forever. David knew that philosophy well because he had been approving loans based on it for the previous 6 years. As a loan officer at Farmers Trust, David had watched the agricultural lending boom of the late 1970s and early 1980s, a period when banks were practically begging farmers to borrow money to buy more land and more equipment. The logic seemed sound at the time. Land prices were increasing at 10 to 15% per year. Corn and soybean prices were strong. Inflation was running at double-digit rates, which meant that borrowing money at 12 or 14% interest and investing it in appreciating assets was a rational strategy. David had approved dozens of loans in that environment, loans for land purchases, equipment upgrades, facility expansions, all of them backed by the assumption that the trends of the late 1970s would continue indefinitely. But sitting in his father's kitchen, reading through Raymond's notes about soil conservation and sustainable practices, and the importance of never owing money, David began to wonder if the assumptions he had been operating under at the bank were fundamentally wrong. The question David faced was not just whether to sell the farm, but whether to believe the market signals that were telling him to sell. Every rational indicator suggested that selling was the correct decision. Land prices were at their peak. Interest rates on savings accounts and certificates of deposit were running at 12 to 14%, which meant David could sell the farm for $500,000, invest the proceeds conservatively, and generate $60,000 per year in passive income without any of the risk or labor associated with farming. That was more than the farm was currently producing, and it required no expertise, no physical work, no exposure to weather or commodity price fluctuations. It was the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that any competent financial advisor would recommend. But it was also the choice that assumed the current market conditions were normal and sustainable, and David was beginning to suspect they were neither. David spent the weekend talking to Janet about what they should do. Janet was a nurse, practical and risk-averse, and her initial reaction was that they should sell the farm and use the money to secure their family's future. $500,000 in 1983 was generational wealth, she pointed out, enough to pay off their house in Des Moines, fund college educations for both kids, and still have money left over for retirement. Farming was hard, uncertain work, and David did not have the experience or the inclination to do it himself, which meant he would be dependent on hired help or tenant farmers, neither of which guaranteed success. But as they talked through the scenarios, something else emerged. Janet had grown up in a small town, and she had watched what happened to families who sold their land during boom times. The money felt enormous at first, but it also disappeared faster than anyone expected, often spent on consumption or invested in ventures that failed. The land, by contrast, was permanent. It generated income every year, it appreciated over time, and it could not be squandered on bad decisions or temporary indulgences. Selling the land meant converting a productive asset into cash, and cash had a way of evaporating. By Monday, exactly 1 week after Raymond's funeral, David had made a tentative decision. He would not sell the farm, at least not immediately. He would continue the existing arrangement with Tom Hackett for the rented acres. He would hire someone to manage the cattle operation. And he would keep his job at the bank while he figured out whether he could actually make farming work as a side enterprise. It was not a dramatic decision, and it did not feel particularly courageous at the time. It was simply a decision to wait, to not act on the assumption that the current market represented a permanent reality. David called Roger Dietrich and Brad Kensington and the other men who had made offers, and he told them he was keeping the farm. Most of them were polite but skeptical. One of them told David directly that he was making a mistake, that land prices had nowhere to go but down once the Federal Reserve got serious about fighting inflation, and that David would regret not selling when he had the chance. The prediction turned out to be accurate, though not in the way the man intended. In late 1979, Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, had begun raising interest rates aggressively to combat inflation, and by 1981, the federal funds rate had reached 20%, the highest in American history. The immediate effect was to choke off credit and trigger a severe recession, but the longer-term effect was to destabilize the entire structure of agricultural finance that had been built during the boom years. Farmers who had borrowed heavily to buy land at inflated prices suddenly found themselves facing interest rates that made their debt service unsustainable. Land values, which had been the collateral backing those loans, began to fall as credit tightened and demand evaporated. By 1983, the decline was already underway, and by 1985 it had turned into a full collapse. Land that had been worth $1,500 per acre in 1981 was selling for $800 per acre in 1985, if it could be sold at all. Farmers who had borrowed at the peak found themselves underwater, owing more on their land than it was worth. And banks that had lent aggressively during the boom found themselves holding portfolios of bad loans that would take years to resolve. David watched the crisis unfold from his position at Farmers Trust, and it was a deeply unsettling experience. Farmers he had known for years, people he had approved loans for based on what had seemed like sound assumptions, were now sitting across from him in the bank's conference room trying to negotiate forbearance or restructuring or, in the worst cases, voluntary foreclosure. The conversations were painful. These were not reckless people. They had not made obviously bad decisions. They had simply followed the logic of the market at the time, borrowing against appreciating assets to expand their operations, betting that the trends of the late 1970s would continue. But the trends had not continued, and now they were trapped, unable to sell because prices had collapsed, unable to refinance because banks were no longer lending, and unable to service their existing debt because commodity prices had fallen along with land values. David approved some restructuring deals, denied others, and spent his evenings wondering what would have happened if his father had been the kind of farmer who believed in leverage and expansion, instead of the kind who believed in caution and patience. The irony was that Raymond's farm, the farm David had almost sold for $500,000 in March 1983, was now worth perhaps $300,000 in market terms, but was still generating the same $50,000 in annual income it had been generating before the crisis. The value had declined on paper, but the productive capacity had not changed because Raymond had never loaded the farm with debt and had never pushed the land beyond what it could sustainably produce. David continued renting out the 300 acres to Tom Hackett, who had survived the crisis by staying small and staying conservative, and David continued collecting $70 per acre in rent, later raised to $80, then $90 as the market slowly recovered in the late 1980s. The cattle operation, managed by a part-time ranch hand, continued generating modest but steady income. David kept his job at the bank and used the farm income to pay for his kids' educations and to build a financial cushion that made his family more secure than they would have been if they had sold the farm and invested the proceeds in markets that had their own volatility and risk. By 1990, 7 years after Raymond's death, David had paid off his house in Des Moines using farm income, and he had accumulated enough savings to feel confident about early retirement. Tom Hackett, who was approaching 70, decided to retire from farming, and David faced a new decision about how to manage the land. He could find another tenant, or he could try farming it himself, or he could finally sell it now that the market had stabilized. David chose a fourth option. He quit his job at the bank, moved his family back to the farm, and began farming the land himself, not because he needed the income, but because he had come to understand something about the relationship between work and value that he had not understood when he was 31. The farm was not just a financial asset. It was a system of knowledge, a set of practices, a connection to a place and a way of life that had been maintained across generations. Walking away from it in 1983 would have been financially defensible, but it would also have been a severance, a breaking of continuity that could not be easily repaired. David farmed the 500 acres for the next 18 years, learning the rhythms of planting and harvest, the subtleties of soil management, the economics of crop rotation and livestock integration. He was not a natural farmer in the way Raymond had been, and he made mistakes, but he learned from them, and over time he developed a competence that allowed him to not just maintain the farm, but to improve it. He installed new drainage tiles, upgraded the grain storage facilities, invested in soil testing and precision agriculture techniques that Raymond had never used. He also resisted the temptation to expand, even when land adjacent to his farm came up for sale at prices that seemed reasonable. He remembered what had happened in the 1980s, how the farmers who had survived were the ones who had not overextended, and he applied that lesson even in good years when expansion seemed attractive. David's son, Michael, grew up on the farm during the 1990s and early 2000s, and he developed an interest in agriculture that David had not had at the same age. Michael went to Iowa State, studied agronomy, and returned to the farm after graduation with ideas about sustainable practices and organic certification and direct-to-consumer marketing that David found both intriguing and slightly alarming. But David trusted Michael in the way Raymond had trusted David, not blindly, but with the understanding that each generation had to find its own way of making the farm work in its own time. Michael took over management of the farm in 2008, just as David was preparing to retire for the second time, and Michael immediately began implementing changes that shifted the operation away from commodity production toward diversified crops and value-added products. It was a risk, but it was a calculated risk, and it worked well enough that by 2015 the farm was generating more net income than it ever had under Raymond's or David's management. The question that haunted David, particularly in the years after he retired, was what would have happened if he had sold the farm in March 1983. The most likely scenario was that he would have invested the proceeds in certificates of deposit or money market funds, earned 12 to 14% interest for a few years, and then watched the returns decline through the late 1980s and 1990s as interest rates normalized. He would have ended up with a pile of money, certainly, but the money would have been static, subject to inflation and market fluctuations, and it would not have had the productive capacity that the farm had. More importantly, selling the farm would have meant breaking the chain of knowledge and stewardship that had passed from Raymond to David to Michael, and that chain had value that could not be measured in dollars. Michael knew things about the soil on the North 40 that could only be learned through years of observation. He understood the drainage patterns, the microclimates, the spots where certain crops thrived and others struggled. That knowledge was specific, local, and irreplaceable, and it had been built up over 60 years of continuous attention to the same piece of land. The broader lesson that David took from the experience was not about farming specifically, but about the difference between assets and investments, between things that produce value and things that store value. The farm was an asset that produced value every year through the crops and livestock it generated, and it did so in a way that was relatively stable across economic cycles. It could not be liquidated quickly, and its market value fluctuated, but its productive capacity remained constant as long as the land was well managed. An investment, by contrast, was something that stored value and appreciated or depreciated based on market conditions, and it could be bought and sold easily but did not inherently produce anything. In 1983, the financial advice David received from nearly everyone, including his colleagues at the bank, was to convert the productive asset into an investment, to trade the farm for cash and let the cash generate returns. But that advice assumed that financial markets were more stable and more productive than farmland, and the events of the 1980s proved that assumption wrong, at least for people who did not have the expertise or the temperament to navigate volatile markets. The 15 men who had shown up at David's door on that Friday in March 1983 had all been operating under the same assumption, which was that land values had reached a permanent new plateau and that David, as a non-farmer, should take advantage of that plateau by selling while prices were high. Some of those men had borrowed heavily themselves to buy land at peak prices, and they had spent the rest of the decade struggling to survive. Others had been more conservative, but had still believed the market narrative, and they had missed opportunities to acquire land at depressed prices during the collapse because they were convinced prices would keep falling. A few had navigated the crisis successfully, but they were the exceptions, the ones who had either been lucky in their timing or disciplined in their borrowing, or both. What none of them had anticipated was that someone like David, who was not even a farmer, would turn out to have better instincts about land value than the professionals who made their living from agriculture. The instinct David had relied on was not about farming, but about skepticism, about questioning whether the current market conditions represented a sustainable equilibrium or a temporary distortion. In March 1983, everyone was telling David that land was at peak value and that he should sell. But David had access to information that the farmers did not have, information from his job at the bank about how much debt was being accumulated and how vulnerable the system was to interest rate changes. He could see the balance sheets, the loan-to-value ratios, the assumptions about future cash flows that were baked into the lending decisions. And while he had participated in that system and had helped to perpetuate it, he also had enough distance from it to recognize that it was fragile. The farmers who were offering him $500,000 for land were not offering their own money. They were offering borrowed money, money that assumed land values would keep rising and that interest rates would stay manageable. When those assumptions proved false, the offers evaporated. David's decision to keep the farm was not heroic, and it was not the result of superior wisdom or foresight. It was simply a decision to not act on incomplete information, to wait and see what happened before committing to an irreversible course. But that decision, that willingness to tolerate uncertainty and to resist the pressure to act quickly, turned out to be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in the long run, and it preserved something that had value beyond money. The farm that Raymond had built and that David had preserved and that Michael now managed was not just a collection of land and buildings and equipment. It was a repository of knowledge, a testing ground for ideas, a connection to a place that had meaning because it had been attended to across generations. Selling it in 1983 would have converted all of that into cash, and the cash would have been spent or invested or saved, but it would not have been the same thing. It would have been a different kind of value, a different kind of wealth, and David was glad in retrospect that he had chosen the path he did. The question that remains, the question that anyone hearing this story might ask, is how to recognize when market signals are reliable and when they are distorted, when the crowd is right and when it is being driven by momentum rather than fundamentals. David had the advantage of working inside the financial system, of seeing how the loans were structured and how precarious the assumptions were, but most people do not have that access. They have to rely on prices and on the advice of experts, and sometimes the prices are lying and the experts are wrong. The 15 men who came to David's door in March 1983 were not lying to him, but they were wrong. And they were wrong because they were operating inside a bubble that they could not see from the inside. David could see it because he was both inside and outside, working at the bank but inheriting a farm, participating in the lending boom but not personally leveraged to it. That dual perspective gave him the ability to question the consensus, to ask whether the market was rational or irrational, and to choose caution over confidence when the stakes were high. The broader lesson is that market consensus is not always correct, and the times when everyone agrees on the value of something are often the times when that value is most suspect. David's father had understood that instinctively, had built a life around the idea that sustainable value comes from production rather than appreciation, from work rather than speculation. David had almost rejected that wisdom in favor of the market's wisdom, and it was only luck or stubbornness, or some combination of both, that prevented him from making a choice he would have regretted for the rest of his life.